Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Okay, well, we have a great episode today where we talk about all things Reform Judaism, past, present, and future. But before we hop into the interview, I think it's important to note that we're recording today on Wednesday, March 30th, after a week where 3 different terrorist attacks have left 11 Israelis dead, murdered in cold blood by senseless acts of terrorism. We're right now keeping the families and everybody affected by these senseless terrorist attacks in mind and praying for peace, both currently and towards the future in the entirety of Israel. Today, I have the honor of speaking to student Rabbi Jessica Jacobs. Jessica is not only a friend of mine, but she is also a 4th-year rabbinic student at HUC in Los Angeles. And we really get to discuss all things Reform Judaism here. We discuss the history of Reform Judaism, why it started, how it changed. We discuss current tensions and challenges within the movement. We talk about future reform, congregants, and leadership vis-a-vis Israel and Zionism. As you'll see in this conversation, neither Jessica or I were shy in both our lauding and criticism of all things Jewish spanning the denominational spectrum. So I'm sure that there'll be much in this podcast for you to agree, for you to think about, and for you to disagree. And very much in the spirit of Jewish debate, I hope you are left with some new inspirational thoughts. And like always, if you have questions, thoughts, or even disagreements, feel free to contact me anytime. And now I bring you Jessica Jacobs. Hey, I'm here with student Rabbi Jessica Jacobs. Jessica, welcome to J Life with Daniel.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to discuss all things reform movement, especially the future of what you see the reform movement moving towards. Before we get there, who are you and why did you want to become a rabbi?
Yeah, it's a really great and really big question. So my name is Jessica Jacobs. I'm originally from Atlanta, Georgia. I identify as both a Southern and a West Coast Jew. And I really was steeped in the Reform movement as a child. I grew up at one of the largest Reform day schools in the country and Reform Jewish summer camp. And I happened to be very lucky that my parents had a lot of rabbi friends. And so there were rabbis around me all of the time. And I really gravitated towards them. I think I had like 5 rabbis at my bat mitzvah. And for me, rabbis really symbolized people who were willing to have hard conversations. I also was really lucky to grow up in a world where I saw women who were rabbis. And I never looked at them and thought, oh, that's something I can't be. I always looked at them and thought, oh, that's totally something that I could be. And they were people who were willing to let me ask a lot of questions and take all of their time at the dinner table if I wanted to, because I had so many questions and so many thoughts about Judaism and the world around me from a very young age. And I realized that in a lot of ways that meant that the right path for me is rabbi, right? Because I really want to be someone who is a lifelong questioner and a lifelong learner and who serves the Jewish community in the way that those rabbis served me. And obviously that path and process towards getting here has been long and windy, and I've gone through a lot of different phases with it. And there's still moments where I'm like, oh, okay, this is kind of scary. But I think that for me, like rabbi really epitomizes all of the things that I want to be, which is a learner and a teacher and a pastor and someone who shakes things up and someone who brings people together. And I can do all of those things in the rabbinate, and specifically the Reform Rabbinate, because it's the first movement that ordained women and really did so on a broad scale. And that's important to me.
Yeah, we'll get into Reform movement in a second because I'm excited to talk about that specific angle. It's interesting just to pick up on something you said about the idea of a rabbi being somebody who's a lifelong questioner or seeker. I think that's such a great definition of a rabbi. And I think one of the more common misconceptions that people might have, both internally in the Jewish community and throughout, is to think of a rabbi as somebody who's figured everything out, which I think it takes about, 2 minutes talking to any rabbi, it doesn't matter what denomination, to realize like, okay, this person can probably, give me a lot more questions about the world than actual suitable answers. But I think that's such an incredible, unique facet of both the rabbinate as a unique type of religious leader and also just Judaism as a tradition that centers questioning and seeking. So I really love that. I'm reflecting almost on the gender aspect to some extent. I also, want to point out we're recording, I think, 1 week after the 100-year anniversary of the first bat mitzvah in history,
Yes.
which, again, when you point that out, people are shocked to know that the bat mitzvah wasn't some medieval or Talmudic institution. What does it mean to you to be a female rabbi?
Yeah, we're 100 years since the first bat mitzvah, and we're still, we've just marked the 50-year anniversary of the first female rabbi being ordained in the United States. And that's an even smaller number, right? 50 years, our parents, our grandparents were alive during that time and had lived during a period where women were not rabbis. And for many of them, it's still a weird and difficult phenomenon, right? For many people in the world and in the US, Jews and otherwise. For me, being a woman and being a rabbi are two pieces of my identity. And I feel really honored and privileged to be able to bring those pieces together, right? So I think one of the important pieces about being a woman is that I walk through the world as a woman. I've lived my life as a woman, and I understand the experiences of other women. I've been very privileged in my life to have a lot of wonderful experiences, but I also have had difficult ones, right, as a woman. And I think that for me, that raises a level of empathy for people who might walk through the world and not always be seen in a certain light, or might not always be taken seriously in the way that they want to be taken seriously. And I feel like for me, I really bring that empathy to my rabbinate. And that's a huge part of my identity as a woman. I also think that in terms of, there would be some people who would say, like, there's no difference in a rabbi who's a man and a rabbi who's a woman. And actually, for me, that gender differentiation is important. And I know that other people would push back, but I also think that it's important if someone identifies as transgender, right, and they're a rabbi, or non-binary, or someone is a person of color and they're a rabbi. Like, we all bring pieces of our identity to our rabbinate and to the work that we do. We can't leave that at the door. And so, number one, representation matters, right? Because I saw women in the rabbinate, I believed that I could be a rabbi. And number two, different people experience different things in their lives, and they bring those experiences to their leadership. And they can then open doors and tents even wider to bring in more people of different backgrounds who might not have been brought into the fold before.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm just thinking, when you said representation matters, on a very different level, for lack of a better term, when I was in college and sort of ideologically moving outside of the Orthodox community, I remember personally the first time I actually talked to a rabbi that was also sort of ideologically skeptical about a lot of sort of Orthodox dogmas about the world. And for me to have that mirrored and represented in a rabbinic figure, I mean, very different than my entire identity. I can imagine that's so much more incredible. But yeah, for me, it seems like there absolutely has to be some difference, not necessarily in terms of the day in or day out, or what the sort of wider framework or, sermons that the rabbi is going to give, but specifically in terms of the people that are looking up to somebody. Because again, I think a huge part of Jewish life is the rabbi almost mirrors sort of what does a Jewish life, or what does one such version of living a Jewish life look like? And if the rabbi is somebody who you just can't relate to at all, for a whole variety of reasons, what good is that? Then you're just, okay, maybe you're saying some interesting things, or, making interesting events for the community, but you're really not being a role model in that sense. So I really love that. Do you think, one of the communities that I guess I'm sort of tangentially a part of is the modern Orthodox community. And it's just really interesting to think about the gender piece there, because really for the last generation, or even the last half generation, I think female leadership has sort of been one of the biggest issues of that community. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens moving on, because again, the modern Orthodox community is in sort of a little bit of a sociological paradox here, where you have the highest educational level. I think the American modern Orthodox community has the highest educational level of any group in America. And so you have, the female leaders of the community, doctors, lawyers, professors, judges, all of these things. And then to say, oh, but so sorry, it's not dignified to have a female give a sermon, in public, which is still status quo in majority of modern Orthodox. There are some that are sort of pushing there, right? it's too big of a tension there. And so I'm really excited and hopeful to see a lot of progress made in the modern Orthodox community. And I know there are a lot of great people doing that work. That obviously is not the crux of the issue happening in the Reform community. Before we get into specific Reform Jewish things, how would you define Reform Judaism? It seems that in some way, Reform Judaism has gone through major evolutionary and inflection points that, are either fascinating to nerds like me or boring to everybody else. But how would you define contemporary Reform Judaism?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you add in that word contemporary, because I think in a lot of ways, Reform Judaism is undefinable, right? The word reform is a verb, right? So Reform Judaism is something that is actively changing and moving and shifting constantly. And therefore, it can be something that's really difficult to pin down. And I think that is one of the most beautiful parts of Reform Judaism. And sometimes that's the most difficult part of Reform Judaism, right? Like, how do we actually define ourselves? So there are a lot of ways that I would define Reform Judaism. Obviously, as a denomination, I would also define it as a process, a lifestyle, a mindset, and an identity. So just to back up a little bit so we can sort of understand, I think people automatically think about informed choice, right? Like, and personal autonomy when it comes to Reform Judaism. And that is a huge part of it, certainly. I'm not going to undersell that. But really, the beginnings of Reform Judaism were about a turn to history, right? So in the early 1800s in Germany, there was this whole movement towards the Academy of the Study of Judaism, Wissenschaft Judentum, right? Where all of these Jewish thinkers got together and said, wait, why can't we study Judaism in the way that we study other things? This can be an academic field. And they turned to history, and they turned to science, and they turned to logic as a way to look at Judaism, right? And out of that, in a lot of ways, came both the Reform and the conservative movements as we know them today. Now, contemporary American Reform Judaism, I think, is also its very own specific thing, right? We have to understand how Reform Judaism functions in America, right? Where we have the separation of church and state, which we all know has very much influenced the way that we view ourselves and our identities and our religion, right? Because Judaism has often been pushed into the category of religion, even though it's something that's so much bigger than that. I think the things that really define contemporary American Reform Judaism, potentially even aspirationally, right? These might not be reality, but in an aspirational sense, are big tent, right? Opening our doors and being super welcoming to all Jews from all backgrounds, their partners, whether those people are Jewish or not, and their families, whatever those families look like. I think that part of contemporary Reform Judaism is definitely that informed choice piece, right? Educating people so that they can make autonomous choices in their own lives about how they can live meaningful Jewish lives. I definitely think that that's an area where we've struggled, certainly, right? Particularly with the education piece. And I don't think that you could find a Reform rabbi who disagrees with me on that. And I think pushing the envelope is how I would define Reform Judaism, right? You talked about female leadership in the modern Orthodox movement. That couldn't happen without female leadership in the Reform movement, right? And so trying to constantly be at the forefront of what's next in American Judaism and pushing that envelope in ways that sometimes can be uncomfortable. And I would say that that's also sometimes an area where we struggle because it's easy to be complacent. And it's really difficult sometimes to remember that Reform Judaism is reform and not reformed. Right? The Reformation hasn't happened. It is constantly happening. And we are ever changing based on the world that we live in, just like human beings are constantly changing.
Yeah, so one of the things that I always have found really unique about Judaism and Jewish history is that there's sort of this constant dialectic between tradition and innovation. You sort of see this throughout the Tanakh. Of course, you see this is the sort of fundamental tension of the Talmud of, oh, Moses taught all of this, but yet he wouldn't have known anything that's happening in contemporary Judaism. One of the things that I often bemoan about the Ashkenazi split of the denominations of that beginning of 1800, and this is going to come across as a criticism of both Orthodoxy and Reform, but I just wanted to sort of get your thoughts on this, is it almost seemed like, we had this very natural process of Jewish evolution where we were constantly in this dialectic between tradition and innovation. All of a sudden, we take this very, post-Enlightenment, post-emancipation, people start to now come up with top-down ideologies of Judaism, something that Sure, philosophers tried that in the Middle Ages, but it never really caught on as I'm a Maimonides Jew. No, I'm a Yehuda Halevi Jew, right? And all of a sudden now you have one community, Orthodoxy, which is basically, and modern Orthodoxy aside here, the beginning of the Orthodox movement was basically, the famous Chatam Sofer line, Chadash Asar Min Torah, right? Anything new is forbidden, which of course is very antithetical to Jewish tradition. So they've sort of frozen the tradition part. And the way that you defined Reform Judaism that's in a constant process of reforming seems like there's this constant innovation. And I can see a critique there being, okay, well, then what room is there for tradition in terms of, I guess, the value tree of Reform Judaism? Is there anything that is, well, no, this is a red line because we're Jews. We are not going to do X, Y, or Z because of Jewish tradition, and we refuse to innovate away that. I'm just wondering to sort of get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that that's really one of the biggest struggles of being a Reform Jew and a Reform Jewish leader, are trying to navigate what our red lines are, right? And sometimes we don't know until we reach them and we're like, oh, wait, that's actually a point that I'm not willing to cross. I think that your critique is totally spot on. I think that sometimes we've attempted to reform Judaism as opposed to reform ourselves and the way that we practice Judaism. And I actually see those things as different. I see Judaism as constant and people as changing. I definitely think that there are red lines, right? Most Reform clergy in the United States perform weddings of partners, Jewish partners with partners of other faiths. There are some people who don't, right? I think that there are different rabbis who take different stances on what the conversion process looks like, right? There are different rabbis who take different stances on who can have an aliyah, right? Can a non-Jewish partner have an aliyah in a synagogue? And for some people, that's a red line. I think, one of the beauties and the challenges is that a lot of us are navigating each of those things on an individual level, right? There's actually not a top-down thing that says all of you must perform interfaith marriages. No one can say an aliyah if they're not Jewish, right? And so we have the ability to choose within our communities. And that's a challenge because that means that sometimes our communities feel and look different from one another. And that's part of the reason why that defining of the contemporary Reform Judaism is so difficult. I also would say that I think often people critique Reform Judaism because they assume that it tried to model itself after Protestantism. And that's not actually wholly untrue. Right? In an attempt to, I think there's this idea that Reform Jews want to assimilate, but actually Reform Judaism was created to stop people from assimilating, right? People were turning to Christianity and they said, okay, if this is the model that people are looking for, how do we make Judaism look like this so that they're comfortable with this model? Not because they want this model because they're interested in Christianity, but they want this model because they're actually allowed to be part of society for the first time in their lives because of Enlightenment. And they need to make these changes in order to actually step into society and be active participants wherever they live.
Yeah, this is the biggest paradox, it seems, of the history of Reform Judaism, because the problems plaguing the Jewish community in, let's say, 1820 were that too many young Jews were growing up and wanting to be Protestant so they can fit into wider society. Today, that's almost a laughable problem, right? Today, the problem is young Jews growing up and wanting nothing to do with Judaism. And so the Reform Judaism 200 years ago, the Reform movement, was very much a movement to attempt to keep Jews within the fold, because their calculus, whether right or wrong from a historical perspective, their calculus was, okay, we either have Jews who completely leave or Jews who retain, X% of traditional Judaism, and we're willing to play around with what that looks like. Obviously, Avraham Geiger was much more extreme than a lot of other Reform leaders. Now it almost seems like, and again, I don't know if this is my growing up Orthodox bias here, but just, one of the ideas that I always play around with in my head is now, because the biggest fear of young Jews is assimilation, not conversion to another religious tradition, just sort of not even assimilation for an ideological reason. Just so many people are growing up in, a society that very much preaches universalism and liberal values. By the way, those things are great, so I don't want to sound like I'm talking, about these things as if they're terrible, but people sort of grow up and the idea of a strong particularist identity, especially in America, is very much not in vogue. And I fear that oftentimes the Reform movement, for a lot of young Jews, not in terms of what the movement wants, but when I meet a lot of young Jews on campus and they say, oh, I'm Reform, I don't need to do that. And we're talking about the holiday of Sukkot. It's I don't know what this, as if that's a valid excuse, right? It almost provides a off ramp to saying, oh, you actually don't need to think about Judaism too much because you can just, wear this label. And so it is interesting to see how Reform Judaism, it seems like it is pivoting to meet the problem, because the Reform Judaism of 200 years ago would be absolutely, foreign to any Reform Jewish community now. But I just wanted to sort of flag that problem.
Yeah, I would love to respond to that. And I think that you're right. First of all, it's really interesting, when you say that you meet a student on campus and they say, oh, I don't have to do that because I'm Reform. I heard that a lot in my time working on campus as well. And I think that that's like a little bit of a PR problem in a lot of ways when it comes to Reform Judaism. And I think that that comes back to our difficulty in defining ourselves, right? We often define ourselves by what we're not as opposed to what we are. And that's something where we struggle. I also think that there's potentially such thing as too big of a tent, right? We love this idea of big tent Judaism. But if you make the tent too big, it collapses, right? It can't hold itself up anymore. And there is a really interesting shift. I think perhaps it's happening more slowly than some of us would like. There's this tension between future Reform Jewish leaders and Reform institutions, right, about how quickly these changes happen. But there is a push towards particularism, right? If you came to Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion 25 years ago and you walked into tefillah, you would not see someone wearing tefillin. Like, you just wouldn't, right? Now you walk in and you see men and women, lots of people wearing tefillin, davening in all types of ways, right? Lots of my classmates keep kosher, keep Shabbat in traditional senses. Some don't, right? And that's fine. But I think that our range of expression and our relationship to halakha has changed a lot over the past 10, 15, 20 years. And there definitely is a push back towards particularism. And what does it look like to actually say, like, no, maybe there actually is a specific way that we're supposed to observe Shabbat, and that's something that we need to be teaching people. So it is something that we're definitely trying to navigate. And in some ways, it's funny that you bring up modern Orthodoxy, because I actually think of Reform Judaism and modern Orthodoxy as like sister movements in a lot of ways, in the ways that we think about the world and the ways that we're trying to create change and in the ways that we interact with people. And there's this interesting move where I think a lot of my classmates and even myself would say, like, we're not actually interested in the denominations in between. If I were to be a different type of Jew, I'd probably be a modern Orthodox Jew.
That's really, really interesting. And it's funny. I guess, I mean, so I grew up, very steeped in modern Orthodoxy. I was sort of, weaned on Rav Soloveitchik. And it's really interesting because modern Orthodoxy proposes that, at least that idealistic version of modern Orthodoxy. I'm sure if you go to a, Teaneck or, this isn't exactly what's happening on a day-to-day communal level, but at least in theory, the way that Rav Soloveitchik and before him Rav Hirsch proposed living a Jewish life was in constant tension. So you have this constant tension between modernity and orthodoxy or tradition, and you're sort of never supposed to feel like you've made it, right? Life is a constant journey, and that's a constant journey. So in that sense, I think, there's a lot of connections with the Reform movement. I'm wondering then, it almost seems like, if I had to just, give a distinct dividing line there, it's the binding nature of halacha, where, from some sense, Reform has decided that, if it's meaningful, great. If it's not, it's no longer binding. Whereas modern Orthodoxy, at the end of the day, one of the reasons why I think a lot of people have cognitive dissonance, talking about women issues or LGBT issues, is because at the end of the day, they do view halacha as binding. So it is sort of hard to make moves there. I'm almost wondering, once Reform Judaism is adopting more of a traditionalist stance, it almost seems like the title, right? Because you have so many different denominations that just confuses the heck out of people, right? Conservative, Reconstructionist, Renewal, Reform. It almost seems like there should just be sort of one tent, and I usually like to use the term, liberal Judaism. I don't identify as a Reform Jew, I identify as a liberal Jew. What's the difference? Well, who knows? Because the way that you're defining Reform Judaism, I would say, I'm in there also. I'm very into the idea of informed choice. And, I guess I'm more halachically practicing than maybe average, but it seems like that's well within the tent. We're not at the Treifa banquet of 100 years ago anymore. And so it is just sort of interesting to reflect on the need for distinct categories. And I know I probably seem like, some millennial here, but it does seem almost like the need for any strict denomination once you have, orthodoxy and liberalism. And it seems like everything can sort of fit under those two bubbles.
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right. I 100% agree that we're heading in the direction of post-denominationalism. And I see a lot of value in that. And I do see still some value in having denominations defined in a certain way. And I think we're sort of in this weird in-between point. When you look once again at the clergy of any liberal Jewish institution, any liberal seminary, most of them looked at multiple seminaries, right? So I almost don't know anyone in my class who said, I only want to go to HUC because I only want to go to a Reform seminary. We have people who have transferred from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. We have people who transferred to Hebrew College or to Ziegler, right? Like there's a lot of movement. And I think that actually really showcases very well that we as clergy and as future Jewish leaders often are headed in a post-denominational direction. I think sometimes there can be a disconnect with the communities that we serve, who very strongly identify with the movement and the denomination that they grew up in and that they're a part of. And I'll say that even from a sense of nostalgia, I feel that way also, right? Obviously, the reform movement has been super important in my life. And I think that sometimes having those distinctions is helpful. And I think one of the reasons why it's helpful to have denominational distinctions is sort of what we've been talking about, in the sense that denominations can push each other, right? I think that when we have separate groups, we can influence and push and shift what other groups are doing, right? So if we all fit under the tent of liberal Judaism, is there that same pushing? Maybe there is, right? Maybe there is. But I think that we live in a world where one denomination makes a decision, let's say comes out and makes some big decision, like we're going to ordain women or we'll ordain LGBTQ plus folks, right? And then all of the other denominations have to look at themselves and say, is this something that we agree with? Is this something we want to do? Is this something we're against? And so I think it's interesting in terms of that influence and that decision making. But yes, certainly we're moving towards a post-denominational world.
Yeah, no, I really like that. I don't know if I sort of woke up this morning with the glass half empty, no pun intended here, but it almost seems like the reverse effect could happen, where Reform Judaism does something, and by the very nature that it's reform, oh my goodness, it's reform. If they're doing this, the rest of the community has to run as far away in the other direction. It's certainly, in a lot of the debates in Israel surrounding Reform Judaism, it just, you mention Reform Judaism and all hell breaks loose, even for people who wouldn't necessarily identify as Orthodox, even for your casual Chiloni, secular Israeli, just that name brings so much, animosity for, a whole variety of reasons, mostly bad reasons, but for a whole variety of reasons. And there it's almost like, if you can just explain the thing, if you can go to let's say, either a secular American or more importantly, a secular Israeli community and say, we want to do Jewish tradition, but we don't want a mechitza. We want to make Kabbalah Shabbat a little more lively. We want to allow people to drive there if they live too far away. A lot of the fundamentals of Reform Judaism, we want to also be, questioning the historicity and, accepting evolution, all the things. They would say, oh, that's great. Sign me up.
Yep.
The Haredim are too much, but we love Judaism. The second you then say, and we're a Reform temple, it's almost like, oh my God, I can't get anywhere near that. And it's such a strange, I don't know if it's a branding issue or if people are sort of still stuck on the Reform Judaism of the late 1800s or early 1900s when, the Reform movement did a lot of things, understandably for their historical circumstance, but that no longer really bode well. I can't even tell you the number of times in an Orthodox setting growing up, somebody would show us the Pittsburgh Platform written in, I think, 1885, which very explicitly says Reform Judaism is no longer interested in rituals, no longer interested in Israel or religion, period, no other aspect. And they're like, this is Reform Judaism. Or we're like, oh, I wonder if it's almost still a branding problem there. And then of course, the Treifa banquet and all of those things. And so that's sort of where I'm a little torn. I do want to move on. I'm sure we can talk about this all day.
For sure.
What do you think the future is, I guess, for general liberal Judaism in America, whether you want to think of it in terms of reform or other denominations? The first episode of the podcast, just to sort of introduce things, I talked about my reaction to the Pew poll, which surprisingly didn't get as much attention as previous Pew polls. I think it's because it came out right in the middle of the Gaza war. So most of the Jewish world was sort of focused on what was happening in Israel and Gaza. But as people slowly started to read it, it definitely didn't bode super positive and optimistic for the future of a liberal Judaism. It sort of said that the number of Jews who identify as Orthodox is up, and the number of Jews who sort of identify as Jew by ethnicity, but not of any type of religion, is also going up, and sort of everything in the middle either flatlining or going down. I'm wondering, one, why, and two, what do you think we can do in the future to sort of change that?
Yeah. So, first of all, I'll say that I don't know if I take the Pew report to be as doom and gloom as other folks do. I remember when the 2013 Pew study came out, and for like a solid year, every single rabbi gave their major high holiday sermon about the Pew report, right? And like the future of liberal Judaism is on decline. We can't have intermarriage anymore. Like, we're not raising our kids Jewish. We're not going to be here in 10 years. And it's like, actually, I think we're okay.
Well, maybe it was fixed because of their sermons. I'm totally kidding.
Yeah, right. I think no one was listening to those sermons. We tuned out after a solid 5 minutes, right? Because it was the same sermon over and over again. And I think for me, I'm not interested in operating from a place of fear, right? And I'm not interested in operating from a place of scarcity. So do I think that liberal Judaism is facing a lot of problems in the 21st century? 100%. I think that I would be naive to say otherwise. Do I think that people are assimilating more than they have in the past? Yes. Do I think that people are placing Judaism lower on as a priority in their lives? Certainly. Do I think that that's something that we need to address? Yes. Do I think that we figured it out? Probably not, right? But once again, I don't necessarily think that it's an issue of liberal Judaism. Excuse me. I think it's an issue of liberal Jewish institutions and liberal Jewish leaders. I think that we're not meeting people's needs in the way that they need to be met, right? You talked about, like, I'm going to be a millennial here for a minute. Generational differences are real. Right? The way that a millennial sees the world is different than the way that a Gen Zer sees the world, is different than the way that a boomer sees the world. And I think that when we interact with people and we serve them, we need to take those viewpoints seriously. We can't say, like, oh, you're being such a millennial right now. It's like, no, this is who you are and how you function in the world. If millennials by trend are not people who are interested in paying dues to belong to places, then why are we continuing to try and force them to pay dues to belong to synagogues, right? They've clearly said that's not something that they're interested in. So we need to change the model to serve them. I think that there are a lot of new and interesting Jewish organizations that might not be denominationally associated that are actually thriving out in the world because they've decided to get rid of that classic synagogue model and say, we've listened to you, young Jews, and we've heard what it is that you're looking for. We've heard what kind of experiences you're looking for. We've heard about what kind of learning that you're looking for. We're also going to continue to push you as you say that those are the things that you're looking for. And we're going to try and specifically serve you, right? And I think that in that way, for me, Pew is one part of the picture, but it's not the entire picture. I love data. I think it's so important. But I think that we also need to be able to bring that picture to life, and that there are a lot of new and interesting and innovative things that are happening in the Jewish world that young Jews are actually flocking to.
Yeah, 100%. And even just, one more note on the Pew study in general. I mean, giving people, I guess, a forced choice of denomination or Jew of no religion is almost crazy from some vantage point, because I know so many people who would say they're Orthodox if, given that forced choice, but really if you looked at them and even the institutions that they frequent, it would be much more pluralistic. I know people who would say Reform on a forced choice, but none of the institutions they frequent are Reform. And then, of course, one of my big, pet peeve issues in general, the entire Mizrahi community does not fall into those, neat categorized communities, just because it was a very, Eurocentric Ashkenazi thing. And so for them also, it's like, what do you say if you're a Persian in LA and you go to a shul that's conservative, but somebody asks you this question? I mean, you probably end up saying Orthodox because, you might have been told that's what you're supposed to say. So, there's definitely a lot of problems with data there. One other question. I know that we've been talking for a while. This has been such a fun conversation.
Yeah.
So I noted in the introduction that obviously it's been a little bit of a tragic week in Israel, right? There's obviously been 3 terrorist attacks in the past week at the time of recording now. And there's definitely a lot to discuss there in terms of why specifically this time of year. And, there was some unique attributes of some of the attackers. The first 2 attacks actually coming from Israeli citizens, which is sort of rare if we think of previous terror waves. But stepping away from that for a moment, not focusing on the last week, but just sort of in the big picture, it seems like another major conversation of the future of both reform leaders, but also just young Jews in general, are questions around Israel and Zionism, where now you have, more and more young American Jews specifically saying, well, maybe I no longer identify as a Zionist, or maybe I'm no longer pro-Israel. And it seems like there's, all sorts of changes happening on the ground here. There's so many different questions I can ask here, but I'm just curious to get your thoughts on this shift. Why is it happening? Is it something that worries the future of reform leaders? Is it something that they're embracing? Just any and all thoughts welcome.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts. I mean, I want to start first from a place, as you mentioned earlier, that early Reform Judaism was non-Zionist, right? Because Reform Judaism was based on this idea that Judaism is for us here in America. We were not alone in that idea. A lot of Middle Eastern Jewish communities were non-Zionist as well, because they did not live under Christendom, which meant that they were actually very comfortable and allowed to practice Judaism in the way that they wanted where they lived. Obviously, that has changed over time. But I think it's important to note because I think that we have this idea that Zionism is something that always has been and always will be and has been constant in the way that Jews think about themselves and their identity. And I think obviously from a place of Tanakh and history, yes, it's a huge part of it, but Jews have spent most of our time living in the diaspora, right, in terms of our history. And so I think that is really important to note. Listen, it's really hard. And it is definitely something that we're navigating in the reform movement. And I think that you're right. There's a big tension in between the leaders of the reform movement and the upcoming leaders in the reform movement. And even, in terms of when I think about my classmates and my fellow rabbis, there's a lot of disagreement. Currently still, HUC sends students to Israel for a year. Not all rabbinical seminaries require that, but HUC still has Zionism as a pillar of its institution. And it's really interesting because then there are people who come to HUC who identify as non or anti-Zionist, but then they go and they live in Israel for a year because that's part of the program, right? Will that change in the future? Perhaps. I think going back to what it means to sometimes be on the fringe and sometimes be people who push, I think that oftentimes we think that we want leaders who make us comfortable, who agree with us and who tell us everything that we want to hear. I actually think that as Jewish leaders, it's important that sometimes we make people a little bit uncomfortable and that we play the contrarian, right? And that we say things that make people, right, that people don't want to hear. And I think that when it comes to Israel, that's become really difficult for us, right? The American Jewish community does not react well when people say things that are perceived as negative or critical of Israel. I personally think that it's extremely important for us to be able to criticize Israel. In the same way that I criticize the country that I live in, I want to be able to criticize my other homeland, right? And I think that is a huge part of what it means to be a liberal Zionist, is that criticism. Now, granted, there is this disconnect with some future Jewish leaders who are anti-Zionist or non-Zionist, or who think that Israel is a colonialist project, right, that does not need to exist, who believe that there needs to be a Palestinian state, and the Jews don't need their own homeland. I mean, that's a really extreme version, right? I think that that's what everyone thinks of when they think of liberal clergy. They're like, oh, you're all anti-Zionist and you want to destroy the state of Israel. No, it's not necessarily that. Are there some people who believe that? Sure. I think for most of us, right, or at least I'll speak for myself, I deeply love and care about Israel. I think it's hugely important in the history of Judaism and in modernity. And I really struggle with what Israel looks like. Not because it doesn't have Reform Judaism. I actually don't care. I don't think that Israelis need Reform Judaism. Do I think that they need some version of liberal Judaism? Certainly. And I really hope that they can get that. But Israel doesn't reflect who I am and my identity and my beliefs and the way that I want to see the world be a better place. And I recognize that that's really hard, right? Because we hold Israel to higher standards. The world holds Israel to higher standards. And you could say that that's anti-Semitism. You could say that it's a lot of things, right? Israel is an island alone in the Middle East, surrounded by Arab and Muslim countries. And that's really, really difficult. And so Israel's having to make hard decisions. You talked about the terrorist attacks this week. That's horrific and it's difficult. And at the same time, I don't think that it means that we can't say sometimes Israel does things that are bad.
Yeah, no, there's so much interesting stuff to respond there. I actually, just want to flag that the entire last podcast I sort of did a solo podcast where I talked about this idea of double standards through a couple different lenses. One, I guess, pushback that I can, not only theoretically see that I do see the rest of the community coming at it is that Israel has enough critics among sort of the wider world. And so why specifically for the Jewish leader in someone's life, if we think about, what any type of rabbi does in any type of authority position, why do we need them to sort of be adding to the criticism? Now, I'll just say personally, I don't completely buy that argument because I think a rabbi, as you said before, is supposed to be making somebody feel challenged to some extent in all aspects of life. So I don't think that the point of any good total learning also is to be like, you're a great person and everything you've been doing your entire life is great, no need to change, right? That would make for, quite a boring religious tradition. And so we do constantly have this tension. It seems that because Israel's wrapped up in politics, though, it does have that sort of, gut-wrenching emotional reaction. Whereas if I show you a piece of Talmud that, might imply that you're not giving enough to charity, anybody in the community could see that and be like, you know what, you're right. Like, even if I'm not giving 10% to charity, I'm really glad Rabbi Daniel showed me that text. If I, show, I don't know, any part of the B'Tselem report or the Amnesty International report, it's not going to be okay, I see the merit in this idea, even if I don't, fully believe it. So it does seem like there is that disconnect there.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that you're right. I mean, when it comes to criticism, I also push back against that idea. I mean, if that's like saying, right, the rest of the world can criticize Judaism, but I can't, or the rest of the world does, and therefore I will not. And that's just not the stance that I take in my life. I'm interested in making anything and everything that I'm a part of better, right? And I think that as Jews, that's a huge part of who we are and what we do, right? We have this idea of being a light unto the nations that a lot of Reform Jews struggle with, but I'm actually okay with that. I'm okay with this idea that we need to be the best versions of ourselves, right? The best Jews that we can possibly be, the best citizens of the world that we can possibly be, so that we can make the world better. I think for me, a lot of the struggles that I have with the way that liberal Jewish leaders criticize Israel, and I'll say that I've been one who's done this as well, is I think sometimes we struggle with timing. I think sometimes we don't do it at a great time. I think that especially this comes back to a generational issue. I think that the way that Gen Z and millennials communicate is very different than some of our older generations. And there's that disconnect in communication. And I think that sometimes we can push a little bit too hard, right? Like, there are some changes that need to be a slow burn. And I think that there's a sense of urgency and agency and intensity that sometimes comes from younger Jews that I think is really beautiful, right? Because it actually speaks to passion, right? We talked about Jews who literally don't care about Judaism. I'd actually rather have someone have very, very strong left opinions on Israel, because it means that they care, right? They're actually part of the conversation. They haven't opted out. And there are a lot of people out in the world who have totally opted out of that conversation. They could care less about Israel. They could care less about Judaism. This person has taken the time to develop an opinion and to push back. And to me, that's actually beautiful and incredible. But I think that they struggle in terms of timing. I think that there's a struggle in terms of method, and there's a disconnect between how institutions and leaders and communities move and change and have conversations around those difficult points.
Yeah, you said something that I guess inspired this thought. It's not fully fleshed out, so it might make no sense. I'm trying to think. For me, it's not such much of an issue of timing. I'm almost reflecting on the famous Gershon Sholem letter to Hannah Arendt, where he accuses her of lacking Ahavat Yisrael, or just genuine love for for the community. You said something that spoke to me, which is anything I'm a part of, I have a vested interest in critiquing to make better. I think that's a really just incredible point, which I fully agree with. I wonder then if the problem is too many people in sort of the mainstream or Jewish establishment not viewing a lot of the far left views on Israel as coming from, you're a part of this, right? And I think that for me makes all the difference. If somebody's a part of something, right? If somebody's, let's move away from Israel and just use, another example, as somebody, who's, criticized the Orthodox community more than once in my writings and time, I've gotten a lot of pushback for a lot of my writings about the Orthodox community. And to some extent, I understand why, because I've made a conscious decision to ideologically disconnect myself from that community. So why is someone from the outside telling us blah, blah, blah? Whereas if somebody from the inside of that community who's sending their kids to the school, who's, going to synagogue, who's a shul goer and something like that, they can say the exact same thing with, and other people will be like, you know what, you're right. And it seems like for Israel, the same thing is happening. So I wonder, from the vantage point of us wanting to, or, the future Reform clergy wanting to criticize Israel, I think the prerequisite point, not that they have to do, but if they actually want to have greater reception in the Jewish community, purely from a pragmatic standpoint, not even, what's right or wrong, it seems like they first need to sort of brandish their credentials as I am a part of this, whatever that means, and convincingly. And again, there also, of course, is some bias there. There are some, let's say, for lack of a better term, privileges that I have as let's say a kippah wearing, Ashkenazi guy who can probably say certain things, and people are going to be much more hesitant to, say, oh, you're just against the Jewish community than somebody who presents in a very different way. But I think, again, from a pragmatic standpoint, it seems like that first step has to happen of convincing everybody that, like, listen, we're all on the same team, and then criticize, as opposed to it just seeming like, oh my God, why are these people joining like our enemies in the UN and the EU and stuff like that? I didn't know if you wanted to, have a final word here.
Yeah, I would actually, I think that, both in terms of Israel, but the larger conversation that we've been having here is like what you're talking about is theories of change, right? Do we change from within or do we change from without? And I think that there are a lot of ways to create change, and it's up to us to choose which of those paths we want to go down, right? There's this idea of masters. Can we break down the master's house with the master's tools? Or do you actually need completely different tools in order to dismantle that house, right? And so we have to decide, do we want to create that change from within the community, or do we want to create that change from the outside? And I think what you're bringing up is that when we try and do it from the outside, then people say, oh, look, you're on the outside. You're not part of who we are. Those folks who are on the outside say, well, I'm not willing to be on the inside. I'm trying to create so much change that I don't even want to be part of that institution that's on the inside, because it doesn't serve me. It doesn't serve my beliefs. It doesn't serve who I am. And so for us as future Jewish leaders, I feel like it's so important to really decide, what is our theory of change, right? How do we want to create change in our lives and in the world? For me, it's about being part of systems, right? Being part of institutions that are moving a little bit too slowly for me and pushing them along and saying, all right, sometimes we need to move a little bit faster. I don't know if I'm fully willing to let go of those institutions yet, because I do have faith in them. There might come a day, let me tell you, there might come a day where I say, it's too slow for me. You're not making the change that I need to see you making. I'm going to go do my own thing, right? I'm going to be outside of this community and I'm going to create change in the way that I want there. For now, this is the method that I've chosen. And I think that each of us have to, choose for ourselves how we want to approach our communities and the wider Jewish world.
That's really fascinating. Well, thank you so much for coming on. This was such a great conversation. I hope that, just like all good, I guess, reform/liberal Jewish conversations, this leaves off listeners with more questions than necessarily answers. Two quick final questions, one very practical. If people do have follow-up questions, is there any way in which you can be reached, either like email or social media? Second question, I'll try to drag this out to give you a little bit of time to think about it. Is there anything else that you think people should be thinking about or talking about in terms of the future of Reform Judaism?
Yeah. So first of all, if people want to reach me, they can feel free to do so on Instagram at Jess McCole, JESSMICOLE. And when you follow along on my Instagram, you'll also see that I do weekly interviews for HUC of interesting Jewish professionals out in the field. So that's something that you can access there, or you can email me at jessica.jacobs@huc.edu, and I'd be happy to have a conversation with anyone, and I'd love to hear your responses to my thoughts. What do I think that people should be thinking about? I think, I have a lot of thoughts, but I guess I'll say that I think that people should be thinking about what it looks like for them to be living meaningful lives. And I think that that can look like a lot of different things, but I would like to encourage people to push themselves in different ways. I'd like to encourage people to not be comfortable. I think that there's so much meaning and so much joy and so much interesting learning to be done on the edge of people's comfort zones. And I think that if people can open themselves up just a little bit more to something that they haven't considered before, something that feels a little bit different or foreign to them, that we can actually create a lot more understanding in our world. I tend to believe that everyone in this world is looking to live a meaningful and happy and joyous life. And we're all trying to do that in different ways. And oftentimes we get caught up in the minutia of what it means to be human beings, whether that's politics, religion, or something else. But if we can put ourselves in someone else's shoes just for a little bit, just for a minute, even if it's uncomfortable, I think that that's something that I would like to encourage everyone to do.
Amen. Thank you so much, Jessica.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really great.